The Vietnam War, in Vietnam also known as the American War, was a Cold War that occurred in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia from December 1956 to the fall of Saigon on April 1975. This war was fought between North Vietnam and the government of South Vietnam. North Vietnam was supported by the Soviet Union, China, and other communist allies. South Vietnam was supported by the United States and other anti-communist countries. The Vietnam Cong fought a guerrilla war against anti-communist forces in the region. The People's Army of Vietnam engaged in a more conventional war. It was a time where they were committing large units into battle. As the war wore on, the part of the Viet Cong in the fighting decreased as the role of the NVA grew. US and South Vietnamese forces relied on air superiority and overwhelming firepower to conduct search and destroy operations, involving ground forces, artillery, and airstrikes. In the course of the war, the US conducted a large-scale strategic bombing campaign against North Vietnam, and over time the North Vietnamese airspace became the most heavily defended airspace of any in the world. The US government viewed American involvement in the war as a way to prevent a communist takeover of South Vietnam. This was part of a wider containment strategy, with the stated aim of stopping the spread of communism. According to the US domino theory, if one state went communist, other states in the region would follow, and US policy thus held that accommodation to the spread of communist rule across all of Vietnam was unacceptable. The North Vietnamese government and the Viet Cong were fighting to reunify Vietnam under communist rule. They viewed the conflict as a colonial war, fought initially against forces from France and then America, as France was backed up by US, and later against South Vietnam, which it regarded as a US puppet state. Beginning in 1950, American military advisors arrived in what was then French Indochina. US involvement escalated in the early 1960s, with troop levels tripling in 1961 and again in 1962.
So I'm going to talk about the Cold War. And the Cold War was a period between 1947 and 1991, and the precise date has never been clarified. It was a non-military political war between the US and the USSR, commonly known as the Soviet Union, and it was a political war because there wasn't involved any military action between the two parties, even though there was military action with the allies of the two parties. And it started after the Second World War, this period of time, and it ended after the complete destruction of the Berlin Wall, which means that the Cold War also lasted during the Vietnam War. And what led to the Vietnam War was a series of events that happened because of the Cold War, and it had something to do with power gain in Asia and East Europe. And the Eastern European countries were um, were a part were became a part of the communist of became a part of the Soviet Union. But because of that, and because China went communist after the Republic of China, China's downfall, and when Mao got the power in China, and when Korea was split up in North and South Korea, and the Cuban went communist, and then the U.S. decided to begin to take some military action. And in the beginning, they aided the French in their Vietnam War, and Vietnam at that time was or commonly known as Indochina at that time, was a part of the French colonies. Um, so the U.S. decided to aid the French, and Kennedy, he began to expand the military support, and then one thing led to another, and the French went away from Vietnam, and the US decided to take full military action. And that is the series of events that actually led to the Vietnam War. Of course, there's a lot of other things that needs to be taken into consideration, but that is the general reason why they went into the war, uh, because of the Cold War. And the reason why the US decided to aid and go into the Vietnam War was because they were afraid of the communists. And why they were afraid is because the communist was the exact opposite of the American. Communism was the exact opposite of American ideology, and it began to expand more and more and more. So the U.S. was afraid that if they didn't expand too, they would then the Soviet Union would begin to wage war against the Americans. So there was a lot of propaganda, and the first one that can be seen on the left is before the Vietnam War, and that was a warning of how it could end up if we got communism, if they got communism in America. And the second one is actually a comic book about the Vietnam War. So the people were very influenced by the media, and that is the Cold War background.
Vietnam was the first war that issued full freedom to the press and allowing media to cover the war as they saw it. Without censorship, cruel images made it possible for the public to see war as they never had before. The sight and sound of gunshots could be moved from the battlefield and into American homes in less than 24 hours. Many people believed that it was the media that triggered the lack of support for the war. Nearly every media source were against the US role in Vietnam and held a critical attitude towards the war. The images they captured affected everyone who viewed them. They had the power to leave unforgettable and lasting impressions on an entire nation. By the fall of 1967, 90% of the evening news was devoted to the war, and roughly 50 million people watched the television news each night the war was on. As the images filtered across the TV screens and magazine pages, people began to doubt President Johnson's credibility. Because of the cruel images, the US citizens began to make an anti-war.